Hey, this is Zach Log the Great, and I am here again with my friend Chris. And in a slight deviation from previous videos, we're going to be discussing not a poem, but actually a book that I just finished reading the other day, and he finished reading not long ago. And I thought it might be kind of fun just to talk a little bit about that. So, Chris and I will be talking about Oathbringer by Brandon Sanderson, which is book 3 of the Stormlight Archives. So, good morning, Chris.
Hello.
Uh, so, anything you wanted to throw out there as opening thoughts?
Just Brandon Sanderson. Just he knows what he's doing. It's a very long book. It could have very easily been just sort of slow, but he always keeps the pacing up. And when you have no idea what's coming next, like he just takes it in such a completely different direction. So you're just constantly trying to figure it out.
Yeah, and I have to give him credit. Well, okay, and one thing which I had the audiobook version, and I believe you had the print version, Chris.
Correct.
So, which is a slightly different experience. For one thing, I think it's a little harder to tell to get a feel in the audiobook version for how close you are to the end. I'm used to thinking in terms of like X number of pages, but pretty close to the end, I was seriously wondering. Okay, before we go any further, spoilers all over the place. If you haven't read these, if you haven't finished this, you should probably stop now. There are going to be just spoilers, spoilers, spoilers everywhere. So that warning said, uh, but like I was pretty close to the end, and I was starting to think that this was going to have a seriously disastrous ending, where Sanderson's earlier book, The Well of Ascension. I keep wanting to call it The Well of Souls, but I thought it was going to have that kind of ending where the heroes basically just manage to make everything worse, and then the next couple of books are going to be putting that back together. But he within the way he set up the story, he plausibly avoided that. I mean, it makes sense the way he wrapped it up. Although I
Well,
still,
the book basically starts off with them thinking it's the apocalypse is pretty much already over because they have this new Everstorm and they're just thinking it's going to be monsters everywhere. But it turns out that something different is going on. And it's kind of a
yeah, keep
step
going.
down from where you thought it was going, but it makes it almost worse in a way because they knew how to fight. It would be a tough fight, but now they just have no idea what they're dealing with.
Well, and then also again, relatively close to the end, when you see the outside of Thalen City, when you see the Alethi army there turn, you're just like, well, I guess they're done here. And then worse yet, Odium, basically decides to anoint, Dalinar himself as his champion. And it's not clear at all whether or if Dalinar is going to be able to resist. And once again, it. I guess we're done here. Let's see how they clean this up next book. And it didn't turn out that way. Um,
Yeah, I just really loved Dalinar's story in this one. Not only is it a great story for him, but it just recontextualizes everything you've seen about him.
well,
Just as you learn his background, like he doesn't remember all the things he's done. Everyone around him does. So he's
right.
there thinking he's trying to be this honorable soldier in the first and second book, and everybody's well, specifically like Sadius and his enemies, are treating him like he's such a hypocrite. And from our point of view, it's like, no, he's legitimately trying, but they know who he really is.
Well, there is another point to that though, because if I, what is it? When he's leaving the Valley of the Night Watcher, um, and I wish I had a print copy here to flip through because I'd like to check this, but I think he said or thought something to the effect of that he was so distraught by their assassination of Evie that he destroyed the rift that way. I think he remembered doing that, just not the full. I don't know. Like, is this sounding? Am I making sense here?
It's possible, but at the same time, like he spent a lot of time after that drinking
With
and
yeah,
having his memory supernaturally altered. Uh, and honestly, like he might have just been partly in denial. Like there was enough of his memory missing that, I mean, that's entirely possible. But definitely reading the first book, like when he's there, like clashing with Sadius, like you get the impression that this is somebody who's really trying, and it feels like Sadius is being completely unfair to him. Like it comes across as Sadius being the bad guy for not trusting him. But now that you know the story, the Blackthorn is not someone you want to trust.
I don't know. I don't know about trust because has he ever was there ever like betrayal in what he did? I mean, he
I
was
think,
dangerous. You don't want to have him as an enemy, but uh,
but that's the thing. At that point, all the high princes were enemies. They were competing, but they were just trying to do it in a sort of civilized manner. Because at that time, you have a king that is just very weak. Elokar had no idea what he was doing. So it's basically the high princes competing among themselves while keeping up sort of this aura of civility that was just on the surface.
one thing what was one thing I found interesting when you finally learn more about what the Alethi called the thrill, which apparently had which was driven by a one of the unmade, which apparently had just taken up residence in Alethkar for a long time. Um, but because I mean, this is just almost part of Alethi culture, it seems. But when you find out what that actually is, and that it's this basically supernatural entity that almost drives men mad with battle lust, it was interesting to me because it actually kind of reminded me a little bit of some of the more like some of the interpretations of how the Greeks thought of like Mars, or actually wait, the Greeks would be Eris.
Right.
Yeah, Romans were Mars because they just took everyone else and rebranded them. But it reminds me a little bit of the Greco-Roman god of war, and basically it's the idea that there's this force that takes hold of men and uh, drives them into bloodlust, and it's hardly even you anymore. It's just men are the playthings of the gods kind of
Yeah.
idea.
Well, and then there's also I think it's kind of funny because as civilized as they are, like this fighting style, it like literally mirrors the barbarian class in Dungeons and Dragons because you just fly into
Okay.
a rage. If you're not killing something or taking damage, then you lose your rage. So you're basically throwing yourself into the thick of it. You're just attacking, like going against ridiculous odds. But being in the rage, you can like be reckless and have greater chances to hit, and you take less damage if you get hit.
Well, and yeah. So there's the D&D input in this discussion. Um, you mentioned Elokar just a minute ago, and his and I've said this before, and just again, spoilers everywhere. Okay, you're going to find out things. His story in this book is I don't know what to make of it because like he's getting his stuff together. He's finally figuring out how to do something right. And right when he's finally getting himself together, he gets killed.
Yeah, I think Brandon Sanderson might have been reading some George R. Martin recently. But no, like it is kind of frustrating because so long he's just been a character that can't really do anything. And he finally sort of understands what he wants his role to be. He goes to Dalinar. They talk about like having Dalinar in this new sort of high king position or whatever. You have him deciding that no, he has to be the one to retake his city, organizing a team, and for going in with it blind, they actually have a decent plan and they do pretty well up until the point they find out that it's completely hopeless.
Well, and there's two things. Well, or in terms of things that go wrong, their plan actually could have worked if the oath, if the what's Alethkar, yeah, if the Alethkar Oathgate had not been corrupted, had not been turned aside from what it should be, their plan actually, I mean, it still would have been ugly at that point, but they actually could have possibly saved the city if they had been able to open the Oathgate, and they had no reason to know that this was a thing that could even happen.
Right.
Um,
Uh,
so
and I do think it is. I do think it is worth noting, like, and you don't know this until like the very end, but his operation is at least partly a success. They don't save the city, but they do save the air.
right, there's that, and I mean, I, also they gain useful intelligence. Like the fact that at least one of the unmade, um, may be the loyalty of at least one of the unmade may be up for grabs. That's very important to know, and it's that's another thing with this book, and you see this several places. Um, it's an interesting contrast to Tolkien, and I think most fantasy most fantasy novels after him, where there's largely clear a good side and a bad side. Like there's not really like there's not any good orcs. There are men who have fallen, but like you're never wondering if one of the if one of the guys in the black freaking robes, if one of the ring wraiths
Yeah.
is going to switch sides, and that seems to be like he's made the whole thing very much more complex than you're used to, and so you have to like you're trying to mentally map out a much more difficult, a much more complicated world, which is interesting. And of course, to be fair, there's also the chance that like he's going to make a complete hash of it, and you're like, well, why did you have like 10 different sides and all these competing interests? He hasn't yet. I haven't read a book of his that has fallen flat yet, but
Well, I like just the way he builds it. He's done a very good job with the different sides because he does having so many characters and so many points of view. Like it does make it feel more real because you could have a side that's straight evil, but that's not as realistic at least for what he's going for. But whenever you kind of jump into, like in the earlier books, like Eshonai's point of view, and they're like, they have doubts about what they're doing, but they feel that it's what has to be done. And especially from their point of view, like at that point, like they were kind of feeling like they had to do this or it would be the end of the world, like trying to
Well,
oppose the Alethi.
the
And then,
other thing. Oh, go ahead.
well, it keeps going because like he just keeps presenting you with this idea of these different groups, like, oh yeah, these guys are bad, they're evil. But then once you actually get a glimpse of them, it turns out, okay, well, there is some ambiguity there because like the Unmade, who would have thought that the Unmade like weren't 100% evil, even if it's just 99% evil, and there's just like the one tiny chance one of them can be helpful. Well, then that's still more interesting.
The well, and oh, crud, I lost where I was going with that. Um, so yeah, one possibility that I'm wondering if Sanderson is beginning to build up. Um, since we've known since the last book that the shard blades that have been around for a long time are dead spren that had once been bonded to radiance. One moment. Okay. We found that out last book, and then in this one, when some of the protagonists end up in Shadesmar, you actually see the more fully anthropomorphic form of a zombie shard blade. I don't
Right,
know,
the dead eye.
what term. Yeah, dead eyes. Um, and relatively late in the book, you find out that these creatures still appear to have some will of their own. Like they're not completely gone. And I tried looking this up, and didn't see a conclusive answer. But I wonder whether it's possible for someone, if like someone who's already bonded to one of the old school shard blades, if they um, become, if they start swearing the oaths and become radiant, whether it's possible that one could revive, and you could have a retread radiant. I don't know what the term would be.
Well, and you see what's interesting
Um,
about that is we've seen protagonists who are now radiants who previously had shard blades, and that just did not work. So it might be interesting to
there's
see if this is like an alternate path, or maybe the shard blades that the other protagonists had previously used maybe weren't the correct ones for their order.
Right. That was one thing I was thinking because, as far as I know, the only one we've seen of that kind is Renarin. He
Well,
was
Dalinar as well.
No, he had given up his already.
Well, he had given it up, but he had used shard blades for a long time.
Right, but it was no longer It was no longer bonded to him. It was no longer like longer attached to him.
Right. But he at least
Uh,
had the potential to become one, is what I'm saying.
yeah. But yeah. So like there's Renarin, but Renarin became a I can't remember the ones that they don't talk about a lot. I can't truth seeker, truth something. I can't remember what order he is, but and it looks like when you see the anthropomorphic version of Adolin's blade, it looks like that used to belong that was the one. It seems to resemble lifts. It seems to resemble the ones that go with edge dancers. I don't think Adolin has the personality to be an edge dancer. It doesn't quite seem well. We've only seen,
Yeah. Uh, yeah, like there's I feel like that's going somewhere. I don't know if it's going to be the Spren being revived, uh, but it could be
Other
interesting.
hand, I didn't think about that. If you think about him in the what Adolin was doing in the last fight, like in the Battle of Thalen City, when he was like trying to combat the Thunderclast, um, he's doing the kind of things that would be great to if you were an edge dancer. It would be it would be the kind of tactics you would think they would use because he's
That
just
is
trying to
true because
dodge and
he's doing a lot of dodging and trying to circle around his enemy.
yeah.
And
So
I think he even points out that the form that the sword is locked in is pretty much designed for that type of enemy because it's
well,
a little bit too long for
go
what would you would normally use for dueling, but it seems to be for hacking out bits of like a thunderclast.
I think he's talking about shard blades in general at that point.
It's
I don't know.
possible.
Yeah, I actually just last night I finished the book. I finished the book a couple 2 or 3 days ago, and last night I went back and I got my copy of The Way of Kings and I reread the prelude to the whole thing. Which do you remember what that is?
Yeah, where it's the well, now we know it's the heralds. I don't know if it calls them there, talking about how they're just gonna
No, it
walk
doesn't.
away and just leave the one guy to handle
Right.
it all himself.
And now you know a lot more about what is going on there, because when you first start this series and you first hear that, you're just like, okay, there was a fight, and you guys are walking away from something. I don't know anything else, and so this is I. It's kind of frustrating considering the sheer size of these books, but I get the feeling that there's going to be a lot to be found out in rereads.
Right.
That there's going to be quite a few things that you're like, oh, I didn't notice that before. I totally should have.
You're right. I could definitely understand why they take so long to come out in between books, just because to begin with they're really long and they're just really well put together where you just learn something that just puts everything else in a completely different context. And this
Well,
book
and what?
especially drops a lot of information.
Yeah, and one other thing about most of Brandon Sanderson's books that I've read, it seems it's very clear that this is a guy who's played a lot of RPGs because, like, they're pretty much like the way he describes everything. Like it, you can almost without it would take very little effort to turn this into a set of RPG rules.
Well, I
Um,
think part of that
like
is the hard fantasy, like the hard magic system.
yeah,
Because really, if you're just writing a book, then there's no need in that to specifically nail down every aspect. You can get it enough. Whereas if you're constructing rules for an RPG, you need to get those rules down because people are going to be using it, they're going to be stretching it. So I think it's just taking the time to nail down every aspect of the magic system where there might be weird cases that don't seem to fit, but at least like in reading the books, like it feels like, oh yeah, well we don't actually have the manual. We're just seeing the players do it. So there's an explanation for that. So when they're doing these things that don't seem to fit, that's just because we're working with the incomplete information. It doesn't feel like they're breaking the system.
well, and but give me a second. There's more than one way to do that. Like in Harry Potter, for instance, you generally don't feel like she's cheating, like Rowling is cheating the way she writes them. But at the same time, it would be much easier for J.K. Rowling to pull out some spell you hadn't heard of before like she can just throw things in, and there's much less need for a definite consistency. Whereas in most of the Brandon Sanderson books I've read so far, um, he hard fantasy is the term he uses. I don't know. Does anyone else write that? I haven't encountered anything else quite the same way.
Yeah, I don't know, but to bring it back to like the RPG analogy, like it seems like it would be really frustrating playing a Harry Potter RPG, just because if you come up against an enemy, like they could just have some magic item that you've never heard of, had no reason to believe could have even existed. Just because the magic there is just all over the place, which is fine for what she's trying to construct. But I think a fun part of Brandon Sanderson's books is that you feel like there is stuff that you could discover that if you had a little bit more information, that you were a little bit more clever, you could just piece together everything.
Right, like you get to play along. Would be another way of saying it. Like you get to try and see. You get to try and like look at the rules, and try and piece together and try and figure out the things that he's going to come up with, that he's not come up with, the things that he's going to reveal later, and you get to try and piece all these things together yourself in a much more. It doesn't feel like you're kind of randomly guessing, which
Right.
is what Harry Potter, which is what Harry Potter kind of fantasy would lead to, or and nothing against him, but like Jim Butcher. There's not the same. He is a little stricter,
Yeah,
but there's not the same kind of
and with
very clear rules of the game.
well, and with Jim Butcher, he spells out the sort of general rules, and you can sort of see them in action. He has room to stretch, but at the same time, he doesn't take advantage of that too much, so it usually doesn't feel cheap. Usually, when he does something ridiculous, it's just so awesome that you don't even care. Uh, yeah, and like honestly, like Terry Pratchett, he just throws in ridiculous stuff constantly, but
well,
it's
Terry
just sort of
Pratchett is
fun.
well, yeah, and he's also kind of explicitly parody or satire. So like there's what's the rule of funny is to borrow a TV tropes term is very much in force with Terry Pratchett books.
Right. But yeah, so it's just a point saying there's nothing wrong with having like a softer magic system. But yeah, just the way that Brandon Sanderson does it, it's just very different from what I've read in other artists, and it just works.
Well, it's also the kind of thing you would more typically see in hard SF writers. Like in hard science fiction writers, they'll more or less lay out the rules of how the world works, and then you get to try and figure out what's coming. And most fantasy writers don't don't do that to the same extent, and so the blending of those two styles, I think, is very interesting results. So was there any other aspect of the book you wanted to bring up quick? Well, but what time?
Well, the thing is, okay, so we talked about Dalinar a decent amount, but really, like, there's still all these other main characters that we just didn't really mention. I mean, a lot of the stuff that was going on with Kaladin was pretty interesting. He finally got to return home and see his parents. He was actually able to like hang out with the Parshendi and actually sort of got close to them for a moment.
And then they got punished for it.
Yes. well, and then like Moash's story still like sort of ties in because he's still part of Bridge 4.
Oh gosh.
Uh, yeah, or at least was part of Bridge 4. I doubt if they would claim him at this point. Uh, but yeah, like all of that stuff was just pretty interesting, especially seeing like whenever he goes back and he sees that Light Eyes that caused him all that trouble, and he punches him, and then he realizes that despite all of that, he still needs them, and in the face of the end of the world, even those terrible things that he's done are still kind of minor.
Right.
And after punching the guy, he has to sort of apologize. And then also seeing, what is it, the I can't remember her name, but that girl that he had been in love with, and
Oh,
she is just not having any of the judgment.
the in his hometown, Laurel,
Laurel,
Laurel.
I believe that's
Yeah.
it. But yeah, he's there like acting like she's in this terrible spot, and she's like, no, I'm fine. And like it doesn't feel, at least to me, it didn't feel like she was just saying that. It like she might have been happy like before, the Parshendi started doing everything.
Well, and it's also the thing of, so especially in someone in her position, you know, a noble woman, um, in that kind of society, arranged marriage is kind of how things tend to work, and the idea that you get to pick your spouse because of romantic feelings, well, that's not uh, that's not wouldn't necessarily be assumed, and it's I might make quite a few people angry here, but if people aren't coerced into it, like if it's just understood that this is the way society works and people are okay with it, I don't think arranged marriage is the most horrifying thing in the world. Um, I mean, you look at how things are going in our society with marriage, and you're like, well, I don't know, maybe that's not that bad.
Oh, well, if it's the cultural expectation and it's applied pretty much universally, I mean, it comes down to that sort of like family duty thing, and this is something we've seen like in the real world with like monarchs and stuff. And I think it does highlight the difference in the Light Eyes and the Dark Eyes, because to Kaladin that would have been completely foreign. He would have had no conception of, wait, you're actually okay with marrying this person you don't love? Like, just because for the Dark Eyes, they don't really have a reason for arranged marriage. Like, unless they have a successful one that's managed to secure a marriage with the Light Eyes, like they're pretty much going to be left to themselves.
Well, and that's one other interesting thing, which applies to some degree to our society too, and to every society. Like, people, you know, give me a moment. People at the top of the social status, like, there are other kinds of problems that they have to deal with. There are other kinds of things they have to negotiate that people without that kind of power, without that kind of status, don't have to worry about. And okay, like, now, admittedly, if you're talking about actual medieval society, like, the people on the lower end are worried about starving. um, so that's a more significant problem.
Well,
But
even if we're just talking about food in medieval society, I do think it's pretty cool. So you have the people working the land, that they're kind of in danger of starving, but they're also in danger of like different diseases from like not having proper nutrition from like not eating enough meat. But then you also have the upper classes that tended to get the diseases from not eating enough vegetables.
I didn't know about that. So I that's
Well,
huh.
the higher you got, the more access you had to anything you wanted. That didn't mean that you were eating stuff that was nutritious or good for you. You were just eating the
Well,
stuff that you liked.
well, and that's part of the problem with obesity in America, at least today, is our bodies and our appetites were designed for scarcity, and we haven't adapted very well to plenty. And so things that you, and so our bodies are designed to, hey, it's really hard to get that thing, but if you can get some of it, if you can get a little of it, it's nice. It's good for us, and so our bodies, our appetites are designed for that kind of idea, but it's not hard to get those things anymore. But our systems haven't adapted to that reality, which is an interesting
Right.
problem.
But yeah, so Kaladin, he gets to grow up a little bit. I think he realizes that in a lot of ways he's still basically a kid. And these light eyes that he's always hated and just seen like no reason for, he realizes, okay, like even if they are bad people, they still possess necessary skills. Like
Well,
this is the group that's been trained to lead, and whether it's good or bad, the dark eyes look to them for leadership. So even if he doesn't like it, he still kind of has to use that. He can't remake society however he wants overnight.
yeah, that's yeah. Well, I thought it was also kind of funny when he was in the city guard, briefly a part of the city guard in Alethkar, and he was trying to pretend to be a ordinary light eyes rather than a dark eyed turned radiant, and there's that moment where he's thinking to himself, "Hello, fellow light eyes. Isn't it nice that we have lighter eyes than those dark eyes?" And just like how badly he's managing fitting into this, and how little he understands that that's pretty
Yeah.
fun.
Well, and that kind of ties into what we were talking about earlier, where you have this idea of this other group that is just completely evil. And then once you sort of see a little bit about them, you realize, okay, they're not 100% evil. There might be some good there. And that's very much been part of Kaladin's journey, because he just started off hating every light eyes.
Well, and the other thing with that, it's Hanlon. It's Hanlon's razor is the term. Uh, what is it? If give me a second. It's never ascribe to malice what can be sufficiently explained by stupidity. Um, and so Elokar's poor management of his subjects inadvertently resulted in what? Well, let's see. I actually don't remember the details of Moash's story. I just know that Moash is angry at Elokar for what happened to his grandparents, but I don't remember the
Yes, I
details.
think some light eyes just sort of like ran him out of business so they could take over in that area.
But then, well, no, it was worse. It was something worse than that.
Well,
And
I think he had them like imprisoned, where
yeah, but
they faked some sort of crime. They framed them, so they were imprisoned, and then from the fallout of it, they sent what's his name, that light eyes, into
Rashon
Kaladin. Yeah, Rashon into Kaladin's town.
and
Uh,
and Elokar is just seriously pissed off at I mean sorry, Moash is seriously pissed off at Elokar over how this whole thing went down, and like having seen how he's changed over the past 3 books, you're like, Elokar wasn't a jerk. He just had no idea what he was doing.
yeah, he was a stupid kid. He was just thrown a whole bunch of power because of the situation with the high princes. Nobody really trusted any of the others to like sort of take over. So they were just like, we'll just let this stupid kid do whatever he wants to do, and we'll just manipulate him if we can. Whereas at the end of this book, when they realize they're in an even worse position with an even younger, uh, uh, heir, they realize this isn't going to work. And I think putting Yasna on the throne is a brilliant move. And it's probably going to piss
Uh,
off all the Ardents.
I hadn't thought of that aspect of it. Well, I mean, let's be honest, Dalinar has been the de facto ruler for some time, and I don't think they like him much better. So I don't know what's going to change anything in that regard.
This is true. At least they, like, Elokar was a sort of figurehead for more of his reign than he was an actual king. But at least, like, the Ardentia had that figurehead. Now they have, like, an actual confirmed heretic, like, as their leader. So they're probably not going to be happy, because now the two most powerful people are both pretty heretical. But still, like, that's a brilliant move. They've kind of learned from their mistakes. People aren't going to be happy with it, but they're just sort of having the little kid rule. There was no way that was going to work, and I do like when they were like, okay, this is not the time to have a regent. Like, they just needed someone in charge who could stay in charge. And Adelin's like, well, I don't want it. I just straight up murdered Sadius. And everyone's like, okay, this is not the time to deal with this. Who else?
What was uh, I am wondering how Yasna's going to handle this, and also that brings up the question of who's going to be the primary character of the next book. Well, because go ahead.
Well, before we get to that, we do still have the other of, like, the sort of, like, three main characters. Like, we haven't even really mentioned Shallan yet.
Not really. It's oh, good lord. I hope
Like,
she doesn't flat out go insane.
Like, the thing about it is, I think her storyline was in a lot of ways the most interesting, but I feel like it's the hardest to get a point, like, to sort of grasp what exactly is going on, because
Well,
there's no just, like, Shallan anymore. There's so many different personalities sort of, like, fighting for dominance in her head.
well, and one question is this just what light weavers end up as? Is this just how light weavers inevitably become, or is this her? Because you don't have another example, so you don't know idiosyncrasy from tip standard model.
I get what you're saying there, but keep in mind, at one point there was an entire group of these that had to function in some way.
Right.
I do not see a whole group of Shallans as being very, very functional or reliable. I feel like a lot.
She's a whole group.
Right. So I think there might be that tendency for them, but I feel like just Shallan is just Shallan. Like, I don't want to say she's not a good person for this sort of thing, because, like, it's an interesting character, and this is definitely a challenge for her to overcome. But, like, sort of within universe, like, she is not a stable person, and this is just making things worse. I feel like she would have been pretty messed up if she didn't have supernatural powers. Just coming from, like, a very, like, abusive and messed up home life, to being, like, having committed some stuff herself, which she might have done even if she didn't have supernatural powers. Like, because at the beginning of the series, she didn't realize there was really anything special about her. So yeah, like,
Yeah,
I,
but
I
at the same time, things started to go wrong in her family because, it, if I'm correct, because she manifested pattern as a shard blade,
it
and killed her mom.
yeah, but people without supernatural powers can get messed up in those similar ways too. Is basically what I'm saying.
Yeah,
So like
but
even apart from that, she's got some issues, but at the same time, there is definitely a strength to her. And at the end, like when she's trying to consolidate everything, like I don't think like any like psychiatrist or psychologist would say what she's doing is healthy, but she manages to deal with it for the time being when it looked like we had lost her.
well, and one other thing, which I find interesting, and which is a plus for the way Brandon Sanderson is writing these books, is like the first book, The Way of Kings, is about like what does it mean to be honorable? What does it mean to kind of bear responsibility? And it matches with the Windrunners. And the second book, which is what's it? The Words of Radiance, is focuses on Shallan and Lightweaver, and it's a lot of it is what is it trying to separate truth from illusion, which obviously matches the abilities of a Lightweaver. And then the third book, Oathbringer, the primary character in this one is Dalinar, who is a bondsmith who unites things, and it seems to be a lot of the to use a an English class term, the theme of the book seems to be uh, the idea of integrity, in the sense of like your whole person. You have to be one whole person,
Right.
and you can't split off this piece and that piece and try and dissociate yourself from other aspects of your personality and still be functional and still
And
be a good person.
I think one interesting thing with this book in particular is the sort of breaking down social expectations. So you have Dalinar now, who's really sort of come to terms with being declared a heretic. You have him at the end deciding that he needs to learn how to read for himself, and then throughout the whole book with Shallan's storyline, part of her issues like was probably made worse by the fact that like she's trying to portray so many different roles that have completely different social expectations.
And
Uh,
also, and also, although she's playing a role, there are a lot of things about some of the roles she's playing that she's not fully aware of that go badly wrong.
right. So sort of the like Kaladin seems to have a much like he struggles with it, but not as much as she does, coming to terms with going from like being a dark eyes to being like in this sort of light eyes world where now he's basically a light eyes himself on command, and having to do this radiant like he just sort of seems to fall into like sort of a leadership role, like that's sort of what he knows, and the stuff that he learns about the world, it doesn't seem to hit him as hard. Like he still has a lot of growing to do. But with Shallan, she was raised as sort of a middle class, like, well, she was raised as a light eyes, but not a very high light eyes. But
Right.
then now she's being thrust up to where she's pretty much at the top as a radiant. But to accomplish the thing she wants to do, she's also having to pretend to be a dark eyes. So she's having to step out of her of her sort of comfort zone, and she's having to do it as completely different people. If Kaladin's awkward, people at least know it's still Kaladin. Whereas with her, if people realize she's not really a Dark Eyes, that puts her in danger. And if people realize that, hey, she doesn't really know what she's doing as a Radiant, it might not be as dangerous immediately, but that still opens a lot of political stuff that she is terrified of. Uh, so that's definitely more stress for that. And at the end, like, I think a lot of the characters sort of come to a point of view where we can't just keep doing things because society expects it of us. Like, we have to change for what's happening.
Um, what time do you have to go, by the way?
Uh, I mean, like, honestly, we could leave it here, but really, this book, there's just so much in it, and there's so much that just sort of gets touched on. Like, there was one thing that did strike out to me. Let's see, I have a little summary open. Uh, See, the interlude, Kaza. This was in the last group of them. She's the one that's on the boat to soul cast their way into uh Amia. Yeah, Amia.
The the island, the mystery island.
Yes.
That's not
Okay,
in the last
that
interlude.
that
That's not
was
in the last set of interludes.
correct. That is
Okay.
okay, so can the Amians, or at least the one group of them, can they like turn themselves into weird Kremlings? Like,
Oh,
I got
okay.
that sort
You
of
don't. Okay.
impression.
Okay. You would know a little bit more about this. There's a book, a story, an independent story. I read it in Arcanum Unbound. I can't remember the title of it right now, but it's Lift is the main character, and it takes place in another city somewhere else that's a little bit like Rathalos. I don't think it was Rathalos because I get the impression that hasn't been rebuilt, but another canyon city, I think. And Lift runs into another one of those creatures, and they aren't human at all, or Parshendi. They don't turn
Okay.
into a group of bugs. As far as if I remember it correctly, they are like basically a collective of these Kremlings that can, um, with some degree of effectiveness, disguise themselves for short periods of time as a humanoid.
Okay. Yeah, because I had no idea what was going on there, but there seemed to be more. And when I
And
looked it up
if
on coppermine.net, it had a little bit more information, but I didn't see any references to
if I
the other stories.
yeah, and
So,
if I remember it correctly, one of them managed to take down two Skybreakers.
okay.
Um, so and Squire, maybe Squires or whatever, but maybe not full Skybreakers, but regardless, not really someone to mess with. So yeah. Um,
Yeah, and I did just want to say I did love seeing that like random interlude character that had been in like the previous book, like actually sort of tying into the main plot at the end whenever she's working as the sort of
oh,
clerk.
Rissin, is that her name?
I believe so.
Yeah. Well, and also, although she was, clearly a little more significant in the previous books, Venli has been promoted from interlude to main plot. So, I'm thinking we'll see a few more of those promotions. Um,
Yeah.
it is. Go ahead.
Well, like in many ways, looking at that, because it's one big book, but like it also feels like this could have been released as like three smaller books. There is the overarching sort of narrative within the three sections, but then they also, each section does tend to be sort of self-contained to an extent. And yeah, we see Vinley early on, like I think it's the third section where she really steps up, correct? At least as a
Uh,
main point of view character.
they're I don't think it's in the first section. Well, and part of this is I have the audiobook version, so it's not as clear for me when like the divisions aren't. I don't remember those divisions quite as well. Um, but yeah, she's not she's not in the first few chapters. Definitely, she's not a viewpoint character. Um,
But yeah, so I thought that was pretty cool with the character showing up from the interlude. It's definitely coming together like all these random cities that we've seen bits and pieces of now, especially with the Oath Gates open. This feels like a cohesive world. It doesn't feel like these random places. Like there's a much greater sense of how they fit together.
right.
Uh, and like really like I don't know where Brandon Sanderson's going from here because he still has quite a few books to go in the series from what he said, and it's already getting to like planet scale stuff here.
Well, and also, we talked about this before. Like, if you look at Kaladin in the first book, and he's like, "Oh, I was on it. I couldn't save my younger brother, and I watched my squad get killed. I have traumatic memories." And then in the second book, you have Shalon, and she's like, "I'm a double parasite. I have traumatic memories." And then in the third book, you get to Dalinar, and he's like, um, I committed genocide and killed my wife in the process. I have traumatic memories. And you're like, how do you ramp up from here?
Well,
Where is there to go?
well, we do have the series as a whole. 9 people. We pledge to protect all of humanity on this planet, and we abandon our pledge. Just put our one buddy suffering torture for thousands of years. And getting into the Radiance with sort of their history that we now know a little bit of, we may get into I destroyed my entire planet and led the survivors to take over another peaceful planet.
Well,
We
and
have ways to ramp it up.
the other thing now, to be fair to the Heralds, the other thing with them is, I mean, okay, from one perspective, they abandoned their friend, which is a horrible thing to do. From the other perspective, from another way of looking at it, um, you know, he was the only one who had never broken. He was the only one who had never surrendered and started the next desolation. And so, they figured maybe he can just keep it going. And they were kind of right. I mean,
Yeah.
he did. We don't know the time scale, but he did keep it going a long, long time. And from what they said, the previous ones, the intervals had kept getting shorter until it was down to a couple of decades between them, and that just was going to become unsustainable.
Right. Yeah, like it's terrible, but it did work.
And so, yeah, it's one of those things where, like, I've seen TV shows or stories where, like, where people say, well, we can't abandon our friend just because X, and I'm like, I'm sorry, but maybe you can. I don't know. It doesn't seem so obvious to me. If anyway, if the alternative is surrendering this thing, which will make your enemy all powerful and able to conquer the world, maybe letting him have your friend as a hostage. I'm sorry. I don't know.
Yeah, it does sort of get into a ends justify the means thing. Like there's a sort of balance there. But yeah, I mean
Yeah,
they at
that's
like the thing about it is even if we do say that yeah, abandoning your friend to suffer all of that alone is terrible. Like it's not like they hadn't suffered themselves. Each one of them had been pushed to their breaking point many times before. Where like
yay.
the only thing I remember from reading that first book, I actually listened to the audiobook twice for that one, was they just sounded exhausted. Like that's the only sort of feeling I sort of came away with that from, because I had no idea what the context was at the time.
Right, right.
But there was just this feeling of exhaustion where like I didn't get the sense that these were like cruel people or bad people. They had just been pushed to their limits.
Well, and then there's one thing which is kind of interesting question because when you see them in that scene in the prelude to the whole series, um, they're definitely like they've definitely been pushed to breaking point, but they also don't seem to be crazy. Um, and so then there's the question of like was what was done to them in damnation, was that what drove them to this, or was it basically having abandoned their duty and trying to cope with that, is that what actually finally broke them to that extent?
Well, the craziness I feel like is a sort of related to the time span because
That too, yes.
we also see that with the fused, where some of them had the mental strength, the force of will to sort of hang on, others just completely lost it. And we do see that with the radiance to an extent, like some of them that we get a peek into, they seem to still have it together, whereas others, like the one that did last that long, well, he's basically referred to as the madman now. Then you have the one that in Dalinar's flashback he got drunk with on the beggar's porch.
Oh, right. Sorry, you said radiance, you meant heralds. You said
Heralds,
radiance a moment ago. Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, so the heralds, like there seems to be some that are still have it together, because like whenever one of them finally gets killed, like one of them feels it and knows what it means.
Well, there's four. If I have if I have everything together, there's four whose status we are aware of to some degree. There's Ash, um, who's the one who has this compulsion to destroy any representations of her. There's the guy whose name I can't recall correctly, who is effectively a king in some Eastern kingdom, and is you know is kind of regarded as a he's their King Kim Jong Un. Um, there's there's the one who it turns out had been a beggar by the Kolin Palace for who knows how long, and that actually kind of makes sense because no one would even like, people don't pay enough attention. Like it's conceivable that like he could have literally been there for centuries and people just didn't pay enough attention to realize
Well,
like
and
that
if
kind
he's
of
like
person.
mumbling stuff about like desolations and stuff, like they might, like that doesn't seem out of place for somebody who's sort of like crazy and drunk all the time.
Right. And then the fourth one that we're aware of is Town, or I forget his the other versions of his name. I'm gonna have to sign off soon. By the way, my computer is running out of battery power. I didn't plug in for this,
Oh, okay.
but
Well, yeah, like honestly,
but
like we could just keep going on and on about this book and the
yes,
series and Brandon Sanderson in general. So at some
but
point, it's just gonna be, we'll just have to cut off.
But yeah, so like I said, there's four that we know of whose status we're aware of, and all of them are like there's not one of them that's remotely together or that you really want to spend a lot of time with.
Yeah,
Like
but
every single one of them
there's
is gone.
definitely sort of a spectrum of lucidity there.
Well, yes, that too. Okay. Yeah, it's probably time to sign off for this. Hopefully I will be talking to you again soon, and we will be discussing Shakespeare's Sonnet Number 2. And I'll catch you later. Uh, God be with you.
Have a good one.
And we are